Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. We're another month down, so it's time for me to recap how May's reading went. So when I put together my May TBR, I kind of celebrated that it was back under my control, but immediately took it out of my control by asking you guys, my viewers, to choose the books from different categories that I would read for the month. So I had 5 categories altogether for that formed a public poll, and then there was an additional poll for my patrons as well, so that they could choose another book for me. And I do feel like it was kind of a mixed month in some respects, especially looking at the TBR itself that I put together, or that you guys helped me to put together. But in terms of the overall quality of the reads that I had, it was definitely one of the highlights of the year so far. So if you've seen my wrap-up videos before, you'll know the drill. I'll start off with the stats, and as usual, there'll be the timestamps down below, so you can skip this part if you want to and just go straight to me talking about the books. But as far as the stats go, I did have 2 kind of DNFs this month. I DNF'd one, and there's another one that I'm going to call Not For Now. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Excluding those 2, I read 5 books in May, which gave me a page count of 2,652, and that's a total for the year of 16,362. The average page count for May's reading was 530, taking the average for the year to date to 559. And then the average rating for those 5 books I finished in May was where it really went well for me. I ended up with 4.5, taking my average for the year to date to 4.24. As far as the series stats go, I've started 5 series this year so far. I've now finished one, so we'll finally get to talk about an end of series book in this wrap up. I've had 4 first books in a series now that I've read and decided that I'm not going to continue with the series, so they're not included in that series started number. I'm up to date with 15 series, so the series hasn't been completed by the author, but I've read everything that they've put out so far. And there are 33 titles on my ongoing series list that I will at some point either finish or decide, no, this series is no longer going to be for me. And then as usual at the bottom, the last stat is the number of days since my last 5-star read. I had 2 this month, so that's currently sitting at 17 days. So as I said, we'll start off with the 2 books that I didn't finish, and the first one I mentioned there was a Not For Now. This one actually was my patron pick for the month. I put together 4 small books, 4 shorter books for the patron group to pick from. They chose The Assassin of Malcazet by Brian Asher, which has been on my shelf for a little while and I was looking forward to getting to. I did flip-flop on this one throughout the month. I do a weekly video for my top tier patrons where I give my reading updates and I talk about various other things, do unboxings of new book mail and things like that. And I did say in there a couple of times as I was leading up to this one that I was considering doing the audiobook. No, I wasn't. I checked out the audiobook and I wasn't too on board with the narrator. I wasn't sure if she would work for me. And then when the time came for it, it was audio that I had available, so I decided to go out on a limb and check out the audio for The Assassin of Malcazet. And I wish I didn't, if I'm honest with you. I think if I'd have picked this one up and read it physically or on my Kindle perhaps, I would have had a better time with it. I don't even know how far I got through. It was only a couple of hours worth of listening, but I just wasn't really taking it in. So this one I've decided is going to be a Not For Now. I am going to come back to it, but I'm going to read it rather than listen to it. So technically the audiobook was a DNF, but I'm not counting this as a DNF overall because it's still on my TBR. It's one that I am going to read in the next month or 2 to make up for not getting to it in May. But at the moment, The Assassin of Malcazet is Not For Now. And then the actual DNF that I had, this was one from the public vote. It won the pick in the sci-fi category. You chose for me Sea of Rust by C. Robert Cargill. And I was kind of looking forward to this one. It sounded pretty decent. It was on my list in the first place because my friend Jonathan at Words in Time recommended it to me directly when I put together a collaboration video for fantasy recommendations. He's a sci-fi guy, so his question was slightly different. I asked him to recommend a sci-fi for fantasy lovers, and he picked this one specifically based on my tastes, so I was excited to pick it up. I didn't really have the best time with it though, if I'm honest. This one it's almost like a Wall-E kind of setting. There are no humans on Earth. I know in Wall-E it's a slightly different scenario, but here humans have actually been wiped out by robots, and you've got robots who are scouring the world. You've got the majority of them in kind of a hive mind. I can't remember what it's called, a one world something or other, one world mind, or I don't know. But you've got various robots who've decided not to join that kind of collective, and we focus on one of them called Brittle as he's going around and he's chasing down other robots who are on the verge of kind of melting down, essentially. They're breaking, they're falling apart, they're having, I guess, memory lapses almost, and he's going out there to essentially, I guess, put them out of their misery. And in the opening of this book, we follow him as he's tracking down one of these robots, and he's kind of giving us the lowdown basically on what's been happening. So he's describing the history, the build up to this war, and the last humans who were killed and things along those lines. And I just didn't really like the character of Brittle. It was one thing that really put me off, because reading fantasy and reading sci-fi, I'm very much used to suspending my disbelief. And I just couldn't do it here. It just seemed a little bit too far, because we've got these robots and this one that we're in the POV of, and he just seems like a human. If I didn't know he was a robot, I would have thought this was maybe an odd one, but a human or humanoid character, a living sentient being. But instead it's a robot, but it seems like all of the feelings and the thought processes are very much human. Now, I get that there's the element of technological advances here, and maybe they've got various emulators that allow them to essentially have human kind of reactions and things. It's a way, I suppose, of integrating with humanity. With things like androids, for instance, they're made to look human, they're made to be human in every way it's possible to make them human, so that they're not kind of as obvious and they're not as feared, and I don't know. But here it seems like this is basically human. He's having human emotions pretty much, he's having human thought processes, he's swearing like a human, and it just didn't seem right for me. I wasn't able to read this book thinking this is a robot that we're following. There are no humans, they have all been wiped out, we are following robots. And it wasn't working for me. I was struggling to pick it up because I just wasn't able to get myself into that headspace of knowing that this character we're following is a robot. So yeah, I was excited to pick it up and give it a try, but it's one that didn't work for me. And maybe that's because I am a fantasy reader who dabbles in a bit of sci-fi more recently than before, but I am still primarily a fantasy reader. If I was a solid sci-fi reader, maybe I would have had a different experience with this one. I don't know, but as it is, I got to, I think it was about 15% before deciding, no, I've had enough. This isn't improving for me. I'm not getting into it, so I'm going to DNF it. Okay, so into the books proper that I read this month, and I'm staying with sci-fi as it happens because I'll go through them chronologically. So over the past few months, my book bestie Nina and myself have been doing a buddy read of The Expanse by James S.A. Corey. In May we were up to book 5, which is Nemesis Games, and spoiler alert, we both really enjoyed it. We've both said, I think, that it's our favourite book in the series so far. So with the last one, I said that it was a little bit strange because the corresponding season of the TV show I didn't really like much, but I did like the book of it. With this one, it was kind of a mixture. I did quite like the corresponding season, or the kind of scenes that were taken from the book, but the book itself I just thought worked really well. It was a little bit different. We see a lot more of Earth than we do in some of the other books so far, and I think the storyline that allowed us that worked really well. We've got a bunch of new characters that come in, some characters we've seen before coming back into the story, and overall everything just came together really nicely as kind of a, I don't know if I'd call it a transition book, because I can't remember exactly what the story of the next one in the series is, but it's definitely a bit of a change from the book that came before, which was Abaddon's Gate, if I'm not mistaken. This one, I won't say too much about it because I've spoken about The Expanse in previous wrap-ups. It is a 9-book series, we're halfway through it now, and there's not too much to say that's going to be of interest if you're not already interested in The Expanse, or of course if you haven't read them, there's going to be potentially spoilers, even just talking about individual characters. So a little bit of a wishy-washy review, but as I said, I really enjoyed the audio of it. I'm continuing to like the narration. Nina and I are both having a good time with the series overall, with the actual story and the characters and the humour and the sci-fi elements in it. This one wasn't quite a 5-star read for me, but it was very close. I gave it 4.5 stars. Next up, I read Marauder by L.L. McRae. This is book 1 in the World of Lunaria series. I was maybe a little bit nervous about this one, if I'm completely honest with you, because I've really enjoyed L.L. McRae's work on the Dragon Spirits, but this is a very different series. And while Dragon Spirits is definitely kind of geared towards my taste in fantasy, there was the chance that this one would not be. There were some elements in it that might not work for me. I have heard some people say that this is a YA book, but from reading it, I wouldn't say that whatsoever. I think it's very much for adults. It's accessible for younger adults as well, but I wouldn't say that it's written or to be classified as a YA book. What I liked here most of all is a continuation, I suppose, of what I really like about Dragon Spirits. It's got beautiful world building. I love the imagination that goes into this. We've got great characters and great story, but if you don't have such an amazing world to place those in, the book can sometimes fall flat. And so far, L.L. McRae's writing has just soared above and beyond many other series in that respect. I loved what we have here. I love all the different kind of species that you have, all the different races, the different take on dragons that we have in the Dragon Spirits. In here, it's not quite a different take on dragons, but it's slightly different scenarios, and I really appreciated it. You've always got to have that. You've got to kind of reinvent some things to avoid the concept becoming stale, and L.L. McRae does a really good job at that. I really like the characters that we've got in here. It's another strength of the author. We've got loss, we've got betrayal, we've got dishonesty and distrust, and I like the way that they're all kind of neatly packaged together in a really nice chunky book that definitely suits me. As far as the rest of the individual kind of elements to this one, I suppose I won't really say too much because I do have a dedicated review for this, which you can see linked in the top corner there. I gave this one 5 stars though, because it was, on the one hand, surprising based on some of what I've heard, but on the other hand, really not surprising based on what I know of the author. It was just a really enjoyable, fast-paced, energetic, good time. The next book I finished in May was another audiobook. This was Pale Kings by Bengali, book 2 in his Emaneska series. I really enjoyed the written book 1. It was a great audio that just really worked for me. And that's one of the reasons I was really happy my viewers picked out Pale Kings for me to read last month. I loved continuing the audiobook of this one. I just think the accent Stephen Cree has is beautifully suited to this type of novel, the setting and of course the characters. I enjoyed the story here. I enjoyed the progression from the written. There are some real heavy hitting betrayals pretty much towards the end of the written, and I like the way that they are dealt with and you get more background information on them in this book. I like the expansion of the world and the new characters that you have brought into it. Overall, it's a series that I'm really enjoying my time with. At the time of filming, I'm currently listening to book 3 in this series because I'm enjoying it so much that I want to continue and see how the rest of it goes. But this one was my second 5-star read of the month, showing that I was having a really good time with it. And then once I finished Pale Kings, I didn't have another audiobook lined up, so I just picked one off my TBR, and this one gave me my first series finish of the year, which is one of the things that went into my thought process as I was picking what to listen to next. So I finished The War Eternal by Rob J. Hayes by listening to Death's Beating Heart. This is book 5 in the series. So again, this is another book this month that is partway through a series, so I don't want to say too much about it because I don't want to spoil the earlier books. But what I will say is this is another one that I've been really enjoying, loving the narration. Moira Quirk does a fantastic job as our main character, Esker. She is Esker in my mind. It's just a match made in heaven as far as I'm concerned. So with this one, I don't know, slightly disappointed, I suppose, because I read it and I thought I wasn't really getting a whole lot of new. I'd read 4 books already in the series. One of them, the first book in the series, was amazing for me. I really had a great time with it. And then books 2, 3 and 4 were really good, not quite as good as that first one, but still very good in their own right. With this one, again, it was good. It wasn't great. It didn't live up to, well, actually, to any of the previous books in the series for me. It was the weakest one, in my opinion, purely because I thought, as I say, I didn't really get anything new. I thought the series could have finished at book 3 or maybe book 4, and I didn't really need this one. So it's kind of disappointing, not just for the end of a series, but for a series that I've really been enjoying. But at the same time, if I exclude that from my reasoning, it was still a good book overall. It got a good score in my weighted ratings. It was close to the mid-80s, which is a great score to end up on, and it got a 4-star rating. So obviously I had a good time with it. It's just, I suppose, that it wasn't as good as the previous books, and a little bit of that does come into it. So I definitely recommend the series, all 5 books of it, but for me, this one was just slightly weaker than the preceding 4. And then the last book that I had in May from my, I think this one was my kind of TBR vets, my physical TBR that's been on my shelf for a while. And the viewers chose for me The Grey Bastards, book 1 of The Lotlands by Jonathan French. This one, well, I've just said it, it's been on my shelf for a while. I've been waiting to read it. I had a good time with it, although I do have a few little complaints, I suppose, about the book itself. So first of all, I like the overall concept and I like the world building that we've got in here. I like the introduction of these half-orcs as our main characters. It's always interesting to see main characters who are not human. It does, I suppose, in fantasy it can get a little bit boring if you're always in the point of view of humans, and when you're outside of it, it generally tends to be, you know, your dwarves and your elves. But we've got half-orcs in here, and I think the author did a really good job at putting us kind of in their heads. As far as the story goes, I did describe this in my Patreon video as kind of a story of 2 halves. There was one storyline to get us through nearly, I think it was, the first 50% of the book. And then something happened and there was a big betrayal, and then we moved away and there was a new storyline. And I was enjoying the original storyline, and I was a bit taken aback by this betrayal and the new path that it opened up. But then I really enjoyed the new path, so it was kind of a bit conflicted for me in that sense, just in terms of my enjoyment of what was going on. With regards to the betrayal, I did say to a couple of people that I didn't like it because it came out of nowhere and there was no explanation for it. And then we went on for quite a long time in the story before we did get an explanation, and by that point I'd kind of lost interest in the reasoning behind it, if I'm honest, because so much had passed, especially in the kind of the scope of the book, the amount of ground physically and I guess mentally that we'd covered in between. There were lots of revelations in here. Some of them did seem a bit coincidental, but at the same time we had gone through various things to open up essentially those revelations, so I can understand that. But it did seem a little bit like little bits were being thought up and just dropped in rather than being necessarily worked into the book, kind of from the start. Overall, it did pull together to a cohesive book, but there were various times when I was thinking pretty much the opposite of that. It didn't seem like it was going to. It was quite enjoyable, but I've decided that this one's going to be on my not continuing list because I'm not really too interested in the overall storyline between book 2 and 3 from what I've heard of them. I felt like this one, although there's obviously more story to come, and that's shown by books 2 and 3 in the series, I felt like this one did end on a kind of a good place to end and a good place to leave it. I didn't leave it feeling that I absolutely have to continue the series. There's a load of loose threads that need tying up or anything along those lines. So it was kind of a bit weird because I gave this one 4 stars. I did enjoy it, but yet I don't want to continue with the rest of the series. One thing I will say about this one, and it didn't really bother me too much, but these half-orcs are very, very vulgar. There is a lot of vulgarity in this book, and although I guess it kind of fits the situation, it only fits the situation because that's the situation the author's written. It didn't have to be that way. But yeah, it's a very vulgar book. There's a lot of foul language in it, which doesn't bother me, but even I felt like maybe at some times it was a little bit too much. So a little bit weird in a couple of senses. Overall, it was an enjoyable book. I'm glad I read it. But yeah, I'm not going to be continuing with books 2 and 3 in the series. So yeah, it was kind of an odd month. It was a bit up and down. The stats, first of all, are really good. A 4.5 average rating for the 5 books that I've finished is fantastic. I did obviously enjoy the books that I finished. I had a DNF and a not for now within that as well. I've got a series DNF essentially, or one that I'm not continuing with. So yeah, it felt very strange, but overall, a 4-star rating for my lowest rated book of the month is absolutely fantastic. Let me know in the comments down below how your reading month went. What was a highlight for you in May? I'm hopefully going to catch you in the next video sometime soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.